What do you think the output of this code? Pause the video and think about it. Okay, now let's execute this. You can see that 3 is printed 3 times. It is not printing 0, 1, 2, even though it seems like that. Now let me change the var variable to let variable. And now see the output. It's 0, 1, 2. So changing from var to let fixed this loop problem. Why is that? Closure is one of the underlying reasons behind both the behavior. In this video, we will understand everything related to closure. Okay, now what is a closure? A closure is the combination of a function bundled with references to its surrounding environment. Yes, this is confusing. Simply means functions keep references to its outer environment so that it can access variables and functions from its outer environment. Let's understand this by an example. Okay, so in this example, I'm creating one function called outer, and inside outer, I'm creating one function called inner. And now you can see that when inner is executed, it is accessing the variable a, but the variable a is not present in the scope of inner. The variable a is actually present in the outer environment, but still the function inner can access the variable from the outer environment due to closure. So now in the output you can see that there is no error. It can access the value of the variable a, which is 1. How this is possible? Due to closure. So functions keep references to its outer environment so that it can access variables and functions from the outer environment. Now the most important question is when a closure is created. A closure is created when the function is created, not when the function is executed. Okay, now what do you mean by creation of the function? Creation of the function means creation of the function object. In JavaScript, functions are just object. So here in this example, we have a function called outer. So let's see the function object. Now you can see that this is the function object of the outer function. And you can see that there are some properties and there are some private fields or slots. Now, so here we are not executing this function outer, but if you execute this script, the function needs to be created first, right? So the creation means creating the function object. Okay, closure creation happens during this step. Okay, so closure creation have two steps. The first step is creating the function, and the second step is adding a link to the outer environment. How this is possible? So you know that this is just an object so that we can add properties to the object, right? So internally what happens is that during the creation process, it adds a field environment. So you can see that this is an internal slot and this is a hidden field. Okay, so whenever the function object is created, it adds this field to the function object and its value will be the outer lexical environment. Okay, now we will understand what is a lexical environment is. So lexical environment. Conceptually, it is a structure which keeps the variable environment and a reference to the outer environment. Okay, so it is something like this, which will have the variable environment where we can access all the variables and the functions of the current scope, and then a reference to the outer environment, which means a reference to the outer lexical environment. Okay, now we already uh, covered that closure is created during the creation of the function. And what happens during the creation? We add a field environment to the function object, and the value will be outer lexical environment. Okay, now this is lexical environment. Now when a lexical environment is created, a lexical environment is created during the execution, and closure is created during the creation of the function. So here, if you take the example of this outer function, during the creation, we added a property environment to the function object, and now we are executing this function, and during this execution the lexical environment of this function is created. Now what happens when the when we execute a function? So we can divide it into three steps. The first step will be creation of the execution context. Okay, now the second step is we need to push the created execution context to the execution stack. Now what is the third step? Line by line execution. Okay, so here the lexical environment is created during this step, during the creation of the execution context. So this is important. Before the line by line execution, the lexical environment of that function has to be created. So in this case, when we call this function outer during the creation of the execution context, we will create the lexical environment. So what all things it will have? So we have a variable a with value 1, and we have a function inner. Okay, so these two are the variable environment. Now the next thing is a reference to the outer environment. So its value will be a lexical environment of the outer environment. So here in this case, the lexical environment of the outer function is the global environment. Okay, now during the creation of the lexical environment, how it will get the link to the outer environment? So we know that during the creation of the function object, we already saved a link to the outer environment in the field environment. So we will use this field to create the creation of the lexical environment. So here it will be outer dot environment. So this is how a lexical environment is created. Okay. At this point, we understand what a closure is and when a closure is created and how a closure is created. Also, we now know what lexical environments are and when a lexical environment is created and how a lexical environment is created. Now let us take an example and understand what happens on each step of the execution. So here at the global level, there is a variable a with value 1, and I have created one function outer, and inside outer I have created another function inner, and inner is invoked inside outer, and at line number 12 outer is invoked. Okay, let me split the screen. Okay, now here in the right side we will write the steps or what happens on each step of the execution. Okay, in the left side we have the script. Okay, so what is the first step of this execution? So the first step is creation of the global execution context. Okay, so during the creation of the global execution context, the lexical environment of the global environment needs to be created. So it will be something like this. So in the global level, we have a variable a and a function outer. So a, and later its value will be 1, and another identifier is outer, and later its value will be this function when the function is created. And the final thing is uh, reference to the outer environment. So for the global lexical environment, the reference to the outer environment is null because there is no outer environment to the global environment. So after this, what happens? The global execution context is created and pushed to the execution stack. Okay, now what happens next? Then line by line execution. Okay, now what happens during the line by line execution? So here you can see that a value of 1 is assigned to the variable a. So here 1 is assigned. Now the next thing is the function outer is created. Okay, so during the creation of the function, we need to create a reference to the outer environment. How do we do that? With the environment property, hidden property. So here we already created the lexical environment of global environment. Now the function outer is created. So during the creation, we have to create a reference to the outer environment. Here it is done through this property. So outer dot environment is equal to lexical environment of the global environment. Okay, so the function is created. Now what is the next line? The execution of the function outer. So here during the execution, now what is the first step? We need to create the execution context of the function outer. So during the creation, we have to create the lexical environment of the function outer. So let's create that. So if you see the function outer, we have a variable b and its value will be 2. Like not now, later when the execution happens, its value will become 2. Now we have another identifier inner, its value is also function. Now reference to the outer environment. So outer environment will be uh, the global environment. So here we are creating the lexical environment of outer. So the outer environment is global environment. And how it gets that? We already added a field to the outer object during the creation of the closure. So we get this by outer dot environment. Okay, so now the execution context of outer is created and the execution context is pushed to the execution stack. Okay, now what's the next step? Line by line execution. And during the line by line execution, what all things happen? Value 2 is assigned to b. Now we get 2 to the variable b. Now the function inner is created. Okay, so during the creation of, so inner is created. Now, so during the creation, we have to create the closure. Okay, how it is created? Okay, so how it is created? Inner dot environment is the lexical environment of outer. So here this is the inner function. So its outer environment is the lexical environment of the function outer. So that's why I here lexical environment of outer. Now what is the next step? So the inner function is created and at line number 10, inner is executed. So what is the next step? Execution context of inner is created and during that step, the lexical environment of inner is created. So we can create that. So inside inner, we have a variable c and later its value will become 3 and anything else? No. So now the last thing is outer environment. So the outer environment will be lexical environment of outer. So it is already created with this field. So it will be inner dot environment. Okay. So the lexical environment of inner is also created. Now line by line execution of the function inner. So what happens at line number 6? At value 3 is assigned to C and at line number 8 the console.log function is called. So again an execution context of the console.log is created and pushed and we are not mm, going that far. We are just interested in the value of A, B and C. So first it needs to print the value of the variable A. Now what happens? So when it sees the variable A, first it checks the variable environment of the current lexical environment. So this is the current lexical environment and it checks the variable environment whether do we have the variable A. And here you can see that there is no A. So when it don't find the variable, what happens? It checks. When it doesn't find the variable, it gives the controls to the outer environment. Okay, so the outer environment points to the uh, lexical environment of outer. So that is this object here. So here in the variable environment there is two identifiers, b and inner. So there is again no a. So what happens? The control again goes to the outer environment. So the outer environment points, this time it points to the global environment. So this is the global lexical environment and now it finds the variable a in its variable environment. Okay, and it sees that its value is 1. Now 1 is printed. Now again, the next thing is b. So what first it checks? First it checks to the current lexical environment in the variable environment whether b is present or not. Now you can see that there is only one variable which is c, so there is no b and the control goes to the outer environment, so which goes to the lexical environment of outer, which is this, and there in the variable environment we have two identifiers b and inner. So the variable b is we found the variable b and its value is 2. Now 2 is printed. Okay, now finally it needs to evaluate the value of c. So it again checks the lexical environment of the inner function and you can see that in the variable environment we have the variable c and its value is 3. Now 1, 2, 3 is printed. Okay, let's execute this. So you can see that 1, 2, 3 is printed. Okay, so this lookup mechanism. So here when it checks the value of A, it is not present inside inner. So it goes to the lexical environment of outer, and there also it didn't find. Then it goes to the global environment, and finally it found the variable A. Similarly, when it checks for the B, it it is not there in the lexical environment of the inner, and then it goes to the lexical environment of outer, and it found B there. Okay, and C, it was already there in the lexical environment of C. So this lookup mechanism is known as scop chain. So this is very important to understand. So, and let's say we have another variable D here. What happens? Okay, we know that D is not defined anywhere. So what happens when we do D here? First it checks the lexical environment of inner, and it see there is no D, so it goes to the outer environment, and then it goes to the lexical environment of outer, and there only B is there, so there also it won't find D. Then the control goes to the global environment, there we have A, there is no D, then it will throw an error because D is not defined anywhere. Okay, so this is scope chain. Now let me change this example a little bit and do the process again. Okay, so I'm going to clear this. Okay, so this time what I'm doing is, instead of executing inner from inside, I'm going to return the function inner. Okay, and here I'm calling the function outer. So what happens when we call the outer? So this will be executed, and the function inner will be created, and that function will be returned. And here what I'm doing, that reference of the returned function is saved to the variable inner fn, and at the next line I'm calling inner fn. Okay, now again let's understand what happens in each step. So the first step is we need to create the global execution context. So during the creation of the global execution context, we have to create the lexical environment of the global environment. So we have A, its value will become 1. Okay, now we have another variable inner fn, or first, yeah, we have outer, and its value will become a function later. So let's, and what else? We have another variable inner fn. Okay, inner fn. So let's keep it like this now. Okay, and finally reference to the outer environment, so which is null. Okay, so now the lexical environment of the global environment is created, and the global execution context is created and pushed to the execution stack. Now the line by line execution. So what happens to line by line execution? A is given the value 1. Okay, and the function outer is created. Okay, so during the creation of outer, what happens? Outer dot environment, what is the value? So this lexical environment, lex env of global. Okay, now what happens? At line number 14, we are calling the function outer. Okay, now the control, so we are currently inside the global execution context, and from line number 14 we are calling the outer. So the global execution context is post at line number 14. Now a new execution context should be created for the function outer, and during the creation what is the first step? The lexical environment of the outer needs to be created. So let's create that. So here we have b and its value will be 2 later, and a function inner and outer environment, which is we already created, outer dot environment. This is the lexical environment of the out function outer. Okay. Now what happens? The line by line execution of the function outer. So what happens here? So you can see that the value 2 is given to the variable b, and a function inner is created. Okay. So what happens when the function inner is created? Inner dot environment will be lexical environment of outer. So which is this one. Okay. Now what happens? At line number 11, the inner is returned. The reference of the function inner is returned. Okay. So here the execution of the function outer is completed. Okay. Now when inner is returned, the value is given to the variable inner fn at the line number 14. So we were executing in from the global execution context, and when we go to the line number 14, the global execution context is paused because another function is invoked. Now this function's execution is completed and it returns the reference of the function inner. Okay, now the function inner, the reference of the function inner is saved to the variable inner fn. Okay, so when we created the global level lexical environment, so we just given the name and inner fn, so we didn't give the value. So now when this execution is completed, it is given the reference. So here it is to the reference of inner, so this function. Okay, now the execution is completed. So what is the next step? So the next step is the execution context of outer is removed from the execution stack. Okay, now the line number 14 execution is completed, and what happens at line number 15? This inner fn is invoked. So again, a function is invoked. So first step is its execution context needs to be created. So during the execution context creation, it needs to create the lexical environment of the inner fn. So let's create that. So here we have, so you know that inner fn is just this function inner. So here c will be 3 and outer env will be inner dot environment. Okay, so the lexical environment of inner is created. Now what happens? Now the execution context of inner fn is created, and it is pushed to the execution stack, and then line by line execution. Now at line number 6, the value 3 is given to the variable c, and at line number 8, again console.log is called, so eventually it will create a context of console.log and pushed, but we will focus on the value of a, b, and c. So here first thing is a. Okay, so it checks the variable environment of the current lexical environment, and it won't find a there. then the control goes to the outer environment. So here the outer environment is inner.environment. Okay, and we know that inner.environment is the lexical environment of the function outer. The important thing to understand here is the execution context of outer is removed from the execution stack. But from this lexical environment, we can still access the lexical environment of outer. Since we are able to access it from the lexical environment of inner, the lexical environment of outer is not removed from the memory. Okay, this is an important understanding. Here again I will tell. So during the execution of the function outer, so when the reference of the inner is returned, the execution context of outer is removed from the execution stack. But still, this function, the returned function, is still alive. It is not removed, it is there. So since it is there, its lexical environment is also present, and through its lexical environment, it can still have access to the outer lexical environment, which is the lexical environment of the function outer. So that even though the execution context is not present, it can still go to the uh, outer environment, and it checks whether the variable a is present here in the variable environment, and it won't find, and then it goes to the outer environment, which is the global environment, and then it will get a and 1 will be printed. Okay, now what is the next value? It's b. Again, it checks the variable environment of the current lexical environment, and there is no b, so it goes to the outer environment. Again, this is not yet removed from the memory, so it finds the variable b. Okay, now it prints the variable, the value of b, which is 2, and then c is present in the current variable environment, and 3 is printed. Okay, now why it is not removed? So even though the execution context of outer is removed, through this object or through this through this structure, the lexical environment, we can still access the outer lexical environment. That's why the lexical environment of outer is not yet removed. So let me save this and see if you get any error. So no errors. 1 2 3. So the value 2 is from the lexical environment of the function outer, but the execution context of the outer is not present. Okay, now let's understand the loop problem. So we started with a for loop problem. So here we see that when we use this var variable, it will print 3 times. Now we will find out why that behavior. So now we know how the closure works. Okay. Okay. Now what happens? The first thing is the uh, global lexical environment is created. Okay. So this will be the global lexical environment, and you can see that I is in the global lexical environment. Why is that? So here you can see that the variable I is created using the var keyword. So var keywords, var variables are function scoped. Okay, and here there is no function. Now in this particular case, the for loop is present at the global scope. So even though we are declaring I particularly here, its scope is actually outside of it. Now the scope of I is global level. So that's why when we create global a lexical environment of the global environment, in the variable environment we have I there. So I is created. Now the outer environment is null. Now the line by line execution. Now what happens? So first 0 is given to I, and then the value of I is checked with 3, so the condition is true and it enters the loop. And then this is the set timeout function call. So before we have to evaluate these two arguments, which means the first argument is a callback function, which is an anonymous function. So we need to create this anonymous function first. Okay. So what happens here? So here the anonymous function is created and we added the field environment, which means the closure is created and which refers to the lexical environment of the outer environment. Now what happened? The execution context of the set timeout is pushed to the execution stack and the control goes to the web API. And this callback is not executed immediately, but the callback will be pushed to the callback queue. It will be executed later. And what happens? The next iteration starts and the value of I is incremented. So the value of I will become 1 and the condition is true and it again enters and a new anonymous function is created. Okay, so during the creation of the new anonymous function, the closure is also created and it points to the global environment. And what happens? Again, the same things happen. This callback will be pushed to the callback queue, which is not executed immediately. And then the next iteration, I is incremented to 2. And again, condition is true and it enters the loop and a new anonymous function is created. So here it will be am3. Okay, now what happens? Again, I is incremented to 3 and this time the condition fails. Okay, so it won't enter into the loop. And what happens? The execution of the script is completed. Now the next step is the global execution context will be removed from the execution stack. And now the global execution stack, now the execution stack is empty. Now the event loop checks for callbacks in the callback queue. Now we have 3 callbacks in the callback queue. Now the first callback is removed from the callback queue and pushed to the execution stack and the execution happens. Now the function's execution is happening. So during the during the creation of the execution context of the first anonymous function, obviously the lexical environment is created. Okay, now inside it reversed to the variable I, but you can see that I is not in its local scope. So it goes to its outer environment, and the outer environment is global environment. And there you find the value of I and which is 3. So 3 will be printed for the first anonymous function. Again, the second anonymous function and the third anonymous function, every anonymous functions are actually pointing to the same shared lexical environment, which is the global environment. So at the time of execution of all of these functions, the value of I is 3. So the first one is executed and 3 is printed, and the second one is executed and again 3 is printed, and the third one is also executed and 3 is printed. That is the reason why we get 3 printed 3 times. Okay. Now, when we changed this var variable to a let variable, it printed 0, 1, 2. Right. Now let's find why is that. So whenever we use let variable with this for loop, there is more happening internally. Okay, so let me just create a simple for loop just without a body and explain what happens when we use let variable with a traditional for loop. Okay, so let me comment this and let me remove this as well. Okay, so this is a simple for loop. You can see that There are different things. First thing is the variable declaration happens here inside for loop, not inside the body of the loop, but here at this place. Okay, and we are using let keyword to declare the variable. Okay, so this is a let variable, and you know that let and const variables have block scope, not the function scope. So earlier when we used var, even though we declared here, its scope was outside. Okay, now in this case of let, the scope is completely inside because this is block scoped. Okay, now let's understand what happens. In this particular case, on each iteration, a new lexical environment for the block is created, or for the iteration is created. For each iteration, a new lexical environment is created. So let me explain. So for the first iteration, this is the lexical environment, and which will have, so before, so okay, so if you execute this, first we need to create the global execution context. So obviously we need to create the lexical environment of the global environment. So it will be something, there is no variables because I is not in the global level now. So it's only outer env, which is null. Okay, and now line by line execution happens. Now this is the first iteration. So the lexical environment of the first iteration is created. Okay, this is happening because we are using let variable, and not only because of let variable, we are declaring the variable inside the for loop and not inside the body of the loop. Okay, all these things are important. Now what happens? So we have a variable I, okay, and uh, what is the outer environment? So the outer environment is lexical environment of the global, which is this. Okay, so this is the first iteration, and now the lexical environment of the first iteration is created. Now line by line execution. So this is the first statement that is executed, which means I is given the value 0. That's done. Now the condition is checked. It enters the body of the loop, and the body of the loop is executed, and the first iteration is completed. Now the control goes to here. Okay, so this is important. At this time, before executing this, so this is a new iteration. So a new lexical environment is created first. And it also have a variable I, which is not the variable from the previous iteration. This is a new binding. This is the important thing that we need to understand here. And in its initial value will be copied from the value of the previous I. So what is the value of the previous iteration? It's 0. So this is the initial value. Now what happens? The outer env is just global env. Okay. Now what happens? Now the execution starts and I is incremented to 1. Okay. The condition is again true and the body of the loop is executed. Now the second iteration is completed. Now again the control comes to this. Okay. So before, again a new lexical environment is created. Now again it's a new I and its initial value is the previous value, which is 1. Then outer environment is the global environment. Okay, now what we have to do, this I is incremented and this will become 2. The condition is again true, the body of the loop is executed, and again before the control comes here. So before that a lexical environment is created. Okay, and I is there, the value is copied from the previous iteration, which is 2, and the execution starts happening. Now the I is incremented to 3. Now what happens? The condition this time fails. Okay, so it won't enter the loop. Now this particular lexical environment is not referred by anything, so this is removed from the memory. So you can see that 3 lexical environment, each for each iteration. Okay, so this is how when we use let variable with this traditional for loop. So this is what happens. Okay, on each iteration, a new lexical environment, and the loop variable have a new binding on each environment. Okay, now let's connect this to this example. Okay, now we have the let variable. So we already created the lexical environment. And what happens? So the global lexical environment is created. Now the line by line execution happens. So the first lexical environment is created for the first iteration. So i's value is given from this statement, that is 0. Then the condition is true and it enters the loop. Now what happens? Now we have to create this callback function. So during the creation of this callback function or anonymous function, the closure is created. So we can write. So here you can see that when this callback function is created, the closure is also created, and the closure points to the lexical environment of the first iteration, which is this, and it is not pointing to the global environment. This is really important. Now what happens? The set timeout function is executed, and this callback function will be pushed to the callback queue, and the first iteration is completed. Now it goes to this statement. So before it goes to this statement, what happens? A lexical environment for the second iteration is created and its initial value is copied from the previous iteration, which is 0. Okay, now what happens? This statement is executed. Now this will become 1. Okay, now the condition is again true. It enters, and again a new anonymous function is created. So here you can see that its closure is pointing to the lexical environment of the second iteration. Okay, so this is anonymous function 2. Okay, now what happens? This callback is again pushed to the callback queue. Now we have two callbacks in the callback queue. Now second iteration is completed. Now it comes to the third iteration. Again, everything happens same. So the lexical environment is created and its initial value is copied, which is 1. And then this statement is executed, and this will be 2, and the condition is again true, and it enters, and a new anonymous function is created. So what happens? So here this time, this third anonymous function, the closure is pointing to the lexical environment of the third iteration, which is this. Okay, again the anonymous function is pushed to the callback queue, and now the execution is completed. Now again control comes to here. So before that, what happens? Again, a new lexical environment is created and its initial value is copied. Okay, now what happens? I is incremented and this will become 3, and this time the condition fails, so it won't enter the loop. So this is not referred anymore, so this is removed from the memory. Okay, now everything is executed in the script. So the global execution context will be removed from the execution stack, and then now the event loop checks the callback queue. So we have 3 callbacks. So first this anonymous function 1. So here it is checking the variable I. So obviously this callback function, the variable I is in the outer scope. So here the outer scope is the lexical environment of the first iteration, and there you will find I and its value is 0. So 0 is printed. Okay, now the second callback is removed from the callback queue and pushed to the execution stack, and the implementation starts. Now what happens? The execution starts, and what happens? It's again referring to I. So it is also the outer environment, but this time this is a different lexical environment, and there the value of I is 1, so 1 is printed. Again, the same happens for the third iteration, but it points to a different execution, I mean, a different lexical environment, and there the value is 2. That's why 0, 1, 2 is printed. Okay, so important things to understand. So let me ask you, what if I did this? What if I did this and if I change this, what will be the result? So this time it will again print 3 times. Why? Because just changing it to let won't fix the issue. This time the let variable is declared into the global scope and we are using that variable here. Okay, so at the time of these functions are executed, so this time it refers to the same global environment. Okay, there won't be any like block level lexical environment on each iteration if this is the case because I is declared outside. Okay, so in that case it will again print three times. Okay, so let me see if let's let me run this. So you can see that 3 is printed 3 times. Okay, so now one more case. Let me change this example to a little bit. Okay, and I'm again using var, and this time I'm using, so I have changed. So what do you expect the output of this? So earlier, what we are doing, we were creating an anonymous function. Okay, and this time we are not creating an anonymous function, but instead we are giving the reference of the console.log function, and this is 0 in milliseconds, and we directly passing the argument I. Okay, here. So what do you think the output? Let's execute this and find. So you can see that this time it's print 0, 1, 2. What is the reason? So the reason is because this time, first thing is we are not creating an anonymous function or any function in the new iteration. Okay, so again, what happens here? So this is again a global variable only. I is a global variable, and um, I is less than 3. So 0 is less than 3 and it enters. And this time we don't have to evaluate, I mean, the values are already there. So the value is already evaluated. Now this is just a call by value function call. So when we refer I here, what is happening? I is evaluated to the value 0 already. Now this is given, this is completed. Okay. Now what happens at the next iteration, I will become 1 and it enters the loop, and again this I is referred and it is evaluated to the value 1, and again at the third iteration I will be 2, and again the value of I will be evaluated to 2. That is completed. Okay, now what happens when this callback is executed? So here the callback is just console.log. For the first function, so for the first console.log, we already given the value. So this is not the variable, the value is 0, so 0 is printed. For the second console.log, 1 is already given, so 1 is printed. And for the third callback console.log, 2 is already given, so 2 is printed. So the difference is this time on each iteration, a new function is not created, so there is no closure in this example. Okay, I hope you understand everything related to closure, lexical environment, scope chain, and thank you so much for watching this video.